Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Susan here with the home edition of Your Voice with Dr. Susan. In response to the emergency with this pandemic related to COVID-19, I've been doing online workshops and talks and interviews with different experts to help people cope with all the various challenges that this pandemic has presented for all of us. So I am so pleased and honored to have Dr. Professor, lots of different titles, Joel Weinberger here with us tonight. And in addition to being a professor, he's a psychologist who is a professor, and he also is a therapist. He sees people clinically, and he's an international researcher. And I'm sure there's a lot more, and he's also an author. And he wrote the book called The Unconscious. I think I'm giving your joke away, but I am so like happy to have you here, and it's just great. So thank you for coming.
It's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So Joel, as you know, as I had mentioned earlier, you do talk about the unconscious. And when I was thinking about my work through your lens, really a lot of it is helping people to make the unconscious conscious, specifically around reactivity versus responding. And what I mean by that is most of us will become very reactive and not even pause and think, and we are reacting unconsciously, and that can cause us to do all sorts of things, let alone get into arguments with other people. So I thought it would be really helpful to start if you could just give an overview of your research and your findings and your the short version of what is the unconscious and what the latest research has shown.
Thank you. Asking an academic to give a short version, I think it takes me about a half hour to clear my throat, but I'll give it a shot. So I've been studying the unconscious for more than I'd like to admit, a couple of decades. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that the unconscious is not inherently pathological, which is, you correctly pointed out that we react without thinking, we react unconsciously, and sometimes it doesn't work out. But we also react unconsciously, and it works out just fine. You know, you're not thinking about how to type, you're not thinking about how to drive a car, and you're also not thinking in social interactions. You know how to react to people in certain ways. Where it goes wrong is you've learned a certain way to behave, and that's not working anymore, if it ever worked. And you're not aware of it, and you're puzzled by why things are not working out. And that's when you have to make the unconscious conscious to help people out, if I understood you correctly. So what happens is it's normal for us to learn unconsciously. It's technically called implicit learning. And basically whatever happens together, we automatically associate because our minds and brains are organized associatively. So if B follows A, we just assume A caused B without thinking about it, without knowing about it. Most of the time that works, and a lot of the time it doesn't work, and that's when people have to come to see you or me, is when it doesn't work. So we learn to behave in certain ways. We learn unconsciously how to behave in certain ways. It then becomes automatic. We've practiced it so often, we just keep doing it, and voila, we've got a problem. And in terms of making the unconscious conscious, you need to understand what it is you're doing before you can change what it is you're doing. So that's as short as I can make it.
No, that was even shorter than you needed to. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions to make it even longer.
Okay, I can go on.
Like some people would say, that's baloney. You know what? There is no such thing as the unconscious. And I know that you have ways to show people that there actually is an unconscious. So is there something you want to try tonight in terms of doing with people or suggestions? So that
I have a couple of magic tricks, but it requires audience participation that's hard to do on Zoom. So I'll start by just saying we're having a conversation, you and I. And we are conscious of having this conversation. So I ask anyone listening, and I'll ask you, Susan, because I'm talking to you. You know what you're saying. You're conscious of what you're saying. Where'd the words come from? Did you think to yourself, I will now use this word? And then you thought about it and you consciously created it. You just talk. All right, so there's an obvious thing. I'm also purposely doing another obvious thing. I'm talking and moving my hands. Why in the world am I moving my hands? I move my hands when I'm on the phone. And I suspect that most of you move your hands when are you aware? Do you look at your hands and go, I think I'll wiggle it this way. No, I'll move it that way. It's clearly not a conscious thing. We do it automatically. I can get into the weeds and talk about why we move our hands. The simple answer is that the speech part of our brain is connected to the motor part of our brain. It's connected to movement. And so we do movement. And the two parts of the brain is really the one part of the brain. It's the movement part of the brain. So that's why we move our hands. So those are everyday unconscious things. Now I could do, let me give another example since you're asking. There's something in social psychology called attribution theory, which I think is very important for clinical work, but for some reason clinicians are not aware of it. I don't know how many people listening are clinicians, but if somebody does something, if we see somebody behaving, or if we're a therapist and we hear a story that somebody tells us, we immediately attribute the cause to the person's character, to the person's personality. The simplest example I like to use in my class is you're driving on the highway and someone cuts you off. Wow, what an a-hole that person is. That's the immediate reaction you have. You've attributed something to their character. However, when you cut somebody off, you now attribute it to the situation. They were going too slowly. I needed to do it. I'm in a hurry. I had to be somewhere. This is unconscious. This is automatic. We attribute the behavior of other people to their personalities. We attribute our own behavior to the situation. Why? Because when we watch someone else, we don't usually see what happened before. We just see the behavior. And so now we need to explain it. We explain it in terms of their personality. When we do our own behavior, we carry our personalities with us. We're not aware of that. This is our personality. And so we know what triggered the reaction in us. Therefore, it's situational. Now to bring it to therapy. So now I'm sitting and talking to a patient. Then a patient tells me she got into a fight with her significant other. And I think, and a lot of therapists might think, oh, she has anger issues. Look at, she's an angry person. And then I might suggest that to her. You seem to get angry. And she goes, well, look what the hell he did. Who wouldn't be angry? And then we have a therapeutic rupture and difficulties. And the reality is we're just behaving normally. So what the therapist has to be aware of is that she or he is going to attribute behavior of others to their personality. And we do that to our patients, so beware. Now I've just made the unconscious conscious in myself. And the patient should be told the same thing. You're going to attribute what you do to the situation, but if you do it across a lot of situations, maybe it's not the situation. And once that's out of the way, we can have a conversation about it.
So I just want to underscore the point that you just made, because there's a lot of non-clinicians watching and on the call. What you made so clear is that we do attribute things differently when we think about ourselves, because we know ourselves, some of us, and at some points we know ourselves. Sometimes we're doing things unconsciously, but we're very quick to make judgments and assumptions. And like the example you gave with the car, if we are swerving to avoid an accident, say, then the person next to us doesn't realize that we're doing that, but we do. So we think, you know, why are they yelling at us? But we don't make the assumption that maybe that person swerved to avoid. We just think that they're an idiot, you know, that they're doing something wrong. And I think that lends itself to the whole notion of compassion for other people and not jumping to conclusions and assumptions. And that's what a lot of us do, automatically, unconsciously.
Yes, I agree completely. But the other side of it is we ourselves are not aware of our personalities. They say, oh, I swerved for this reason. I got angry for that reason. I reacted this way for another reason, not realizing that this is characteristic of us and therefore not doing anything to correct it or work on it. So both sides are happening.
Right.
And you need to be aware that both things can happen, that you're not aware necessarily of your own personality and therefore your motives. And you're also not aware of the other person's personality and you're assuming it's their personality. So both can happen.
When I work with couples, I call it the 2-year-olds come out, right? So the person acts like a 2-year-old, and then what happens? Who responds? the 2-year-old and the other person.
Yeah.
So you don't have two adults talking to each other. You have the two 2-year-olds. And so sometimes if one can maintain the adult and not turn into that 2-year-old, then it can go a different place. But it's about teaching more, about becoming more aware of one's patterns. And maybe you want to talk to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that relates to what you said about making the unconscious conscious. Why does the 2-year-old come by? Because you've suffered what we call technically a narcissistic injury, and what in English means that you have hurt my feelings. And when you have hurt my feelings, or I disagree with something that you said, it's not the cognitive part of my brain that lights up. It's the emotional part of my brain that lights up. You call that, I think, more or less correctly, the 2-year-old part of my brain. So we know this. A colleague of mine, Drew Weston, did a study where he put people in an fMRI machine, and he presented them with a political view that was contrary to their political view. And what lit up was not their thoughtful part of their brain so that they could discuss it and refute it. What lit up was the emotional part of the brain so they could be upset, angry, and annoyed and argue with it. And anyone who's been in a political argument with anyone knows that the other person is clearly an idiot and you are clearly right. And why don't they have the common sense to realize it? And the reason for that is because you're not thinking, you're emoting, and they're not thinking, they're emoting, and you're off to the races after that. And then it becomes personal, and we've all had that.
You know, I think for some people who really are not into the research, or it's new for them in terms of the unconscious, this notion, and some people still might be like, wait, I'm not so sure I'm buying into this. And there might be a lot of like students that are learning. So a lot of people might be seeing this later, our conversation. So, and I know some of the research that you have presented, you know, maybe you can talk a little bit more about your findings. I know there's some research about people making decisions, for instance, when things are put on one side versus another. You know, if you could talk to that, because I think you can really speak to what the research has found, people making everyday decisions and how that, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, so I'll give a couple of examples that maybe people are familiar with, and I'll talk about a study we did. So I don't know how many people remember the Pepsi challenge, where you had Pepsi and Coca-Cola, and lo and behold, since it was Pepsi that sponsored it, everyone picked Pepsi. So you might think that they phonied it up or whatever, but what they actually did, go YouTube it and you can see it. Pepsi is always on the right. And people prefer the right. You're not aware of preferring the right. You just, and all the excuses were, well, Pepsi is sweeter. They would have liked Coke if they drank more. The first sip is sweets. No, it was Pepsi is on the right. We're going to pick things on the right. And they've done studies where they put identical products, in this case, I think it was stockings, up in front of people. And they said, pick the nicest one. And they were all the same. And everyone picked the one to the right. Because think about it now, here's the unconscious. You don't talk about someone's left-hand man. You talk about someone's right-hand man. Things to the right are correct. Things to the left are incorrect. The Latin word for left is sinister. The French word for left is gauche. I don't have to go further. You see what's going on. Now, the other thing is what people say and what people unconsciously believe can be very antithetical to one another. So I'll give two studies, and you stop me if I'm going too much into the studies. So we did a study way back in the day. Some of you remember the election between Gore and Bush, the son. And at that time, Gore decided he wasn't going to have Bill Clinton campaign for him because Bill Clinton had been impeached. He had cheated on his wife. He's done all these terrible things. People didn't like it, and he didn't want to be associated with that. And if you looked at the polls, people were saying those things. So my colleague and I, Drew Weston, said to ourselves, wait a second here. He's a two-term president, and if he was in the room next to us now, Susan, no one would be listening to us. They would be going to see him. So we did a study, and first we called the Gore campaign, and they ignored us because they know better. But a couple of years later, we had the technology to do this online, and we do this kind of thing online now. And there was a guy named Gray Davis, who was the governor of California. I don't know how many of you remember that. And there was a recall election. They decided he had been a lousy governor, and they were going to recall him. They were going to bring him back. Okay. So Clinton offered to campaign for him. He did the same thing. This is 2004 now. I don't need you. You people, it's bad enough. They're trying to recall me. I don't need a philanderer and an adulterer and so on. So Clinton didn't help him. And so we did a study. And a week before the election, we did this study online in California. And we presented an image of Bill Clinton, but too quickly to consciously recognize, but slowly enough for your brain to process it. And I should say that the emotional part of your brain processes faster than the cognitive part. Why? Because you better react emotionally before you react cognitively, or the leopard's going to eat you. You don't have time to say, oh, it's got a tail. It has spots. Must be a leopard. So that's the reason for that. Anyway, so we present a picture of Bill Clinton, and then we present a picture of Gray Davis, and we have people rate Gray Davis a week before the election. But we did it with Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And this isn't magic. It's not that you can turn a Republican into a Gray Davis lover or anything like that. What you can do is get people on the fence, so to speak, by associating, which is what elections are about nowadays anyway. So the Republicans, and then there was a control group with just Gray Davis. The Republicans disliked Gray Davis a little bit more because you just added Bill Clinton to him. The Democrats went down in their dislike of Gray Davis because you had added Bill Clinton, and the independents did a 180. If you just showed Gray Davis, they hated him. If you showed Bill Clinton, and they didn't know they saw Bill Clinton, it reversed itself. Totally different. Now they're ready to like Gray Davis. What's the lesson? The lesson is they say one thing, but they think another thing. We did another study. We looked at values, conscious and unconscious values. So we asked people, you know, there's a standard measure of values. I won't get into it. It's a Schwartz circumplex, whatever. And you can rank order your values, and you do. And then we presented those values in a method that got you to do reaction time stuff. Again, I won't get into the methodology. So the top 3 values, I'm speaking from memory now, that people would talk about was, you know, caring for others, finding your own path, and, you know, saving the world or something like that. That's very nice, and that's what people say. Now we looked at the unconscious values, and they were security, sex, and tradition. And all you got to do is look at an ad, and the ads will not get you to buy a product by telling you you'll be a nice person if you buy the product. They'll get you to buy the product by showing you an attractive person and saying you'll be more attractive. So we did this, believe it or not, for an advertising company who said, how can this be? And I said, so what do you do on your spare time? You work in soup kitchens? Or do you look for relationships and try and provide for your family? Well, I do the latter. Well, security and sex. So there's where the unconscious comes in. There's a million other examples I could give you.
That's great. And I would love it. And in a few minutes, we're going to open it up for questions because I'm sure people have lots of questions for you. So when I think about some of the people that are watching, how do we then apply this to everyday life? And what are some of the ways where do you tell, for non-academics, for non-clinicians, when you're working with people, I know what I do, but I would love to hear what you do in terms of helping people, both when I talked before about the reactivity, you know, and responding, both as individuals and also in relationships with each other. And so again, I know what I do, but I want to hear from you what you do.
Okay, I'm going to talk about everyday life and then get into therapy because you said there are a few people here who are not therapists. The biggest piece of advice I could give is watch what people do as opposed to what people say. So if you ask anybody, are you prejudiced? There's no prejudice in the world. Thank God it's all gone. And if you look at the world, it's not gone. So is sexism gone? It's gone. It's gone. It's gone away. That's terrific. I'm so happy. But if you ask people, no one is sexist. And I don't think they're necessarily lying. They don't know. So that's the piece of advice I would give. Just watch how people behave and keep in mind what they say is not necessarily what they're doing.
Joel, I just want to underscore something. Not even watching others, become more aware of our own self.
Yes, that's the part of therapy. So the patient comes in and the world is an unfair place and people have treated her badly. It's a shame that she's had such bad luck and met such rotten human beings in her life. And what's her role in this? All she knows is that she's not happy. Because if she knew what her role was in this, she wouldn't need to be talking to me. So yes, let me hear what happened. Now let's reflect on what happened. Could you have done it differently? Are there alternatives? Is that the only way? How come you react that way? You know, we react the way we've reacted in the past. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So you react the way you reacted growing up. You learned a certain coping mechanism that worked, for the sake of argument, when you were 10, because it was the best you could do when you were 10. You're not now, let's say, for the sake of argument, 30. You have a whole wider range of coping mechanisms. You don't have to react like you did when you were 10. There are alternatives that you have. So in the work, I would try and understand what happened, how they understood it, and what are other ways that they might have understood it, and how is it that they reacted that way? Well, not everyone would react that way. And then, of course, there's the phenomenon of how they treat me. How they treat me gives me a window on how they relate in general. And I can say, you're treating me in a certain way, and maybe I deserve it, maybe I don't, but nonetheless, you're doing this. What's that about? And now we discover how they relate to people in general. And we apply a template to others based on our past relationships. It doesn't always fit. So, and we're not aware of that. If you're a suspicious person, no one can be trusted. If you're a dependent person, the other person has to take care of you. On and on we can go.
You've been studying this for so long, and this is really your passion, that the first step for you is making the unconscious conscious.
Right.
So then what's the other piece?
So that's a good question. So the idea is now, okay, I know what I do. Terrific. I've been doing it for 25 years. It's ingrained in me. It's habitual. It happens automatically. What am I going to do now? Well, you know what you ought to do now. Your job now is to practice doing the more adaptive thing. What you need to do is exactly what you did in the past that's not working for you. You repeated a way of relating, a way of behaving until it became automatic and unconscious. Now I want you to practice this new, more adaptive way of behaving until it too is automatic and unconscious. Because if you have to think about it every time and go, oh yeah, I learned this, and this is what you're gonna 90% of the time not do it. Because you're not focused and thinking 90% of the time, you're just living your life. So I call that making the conscious unconscious. And I think that's a neglected part of psychotherapy, and it's just as important as making the conscious, making the unconscious conscious, but it comes second. First comes making the unconscious conscious.
Yeah. And I think that, what you're saying is so important, because I've been doing a lot of that in terms of there are people that are doing that piece. One is acknowledging it, right? Like what worked, what went well. We spend so much time historically in the field focusing on the problems and what didn't work.
Yeah. So you mentioned reinforcement. That's part of like behavior therapy. And if you're psychodynamic, you kind of throw that out the window, and all the person has to come in and repeat all their behaviors over again, rehab the insight, and 2-3 years later, it's all behavior. You don't get into the weeds about how this happened to be and making the unconscious conscious. You just teach them a new coping mechanism. So they're both missing a piece of the puzzle. The behaviorists are missing the relational piece of the puzzle, that you have to relate to the therapist, and you have to have trust and so on. And that what you're practicing is not as simple as, don't do it anymore, do something else. And what the psychodynamic people have to realize is that practice matters, and that whatever the reason they got to be the way they are, they're that way now. And you have to practice being another way, not just realize that you're that way. So what do? I offer them that as psychoeducation. And we start talking about how, what to do in certain situations, practice in the situations. And eventually, we hope, they will behave more adaptively. Does it ever go away totally? No. It just becomes more probable to behave more adaptively the more you practice it and the more it works for you, because when it works, you're reinforced. And when it doesn't work, you are reminded that it doesn't work, and therefore you're not reinforced. And eventually, we hope, and eventually is not 3 weeks, that you'll behave more adaptively and you'll relate more adaptively in the world. And I'm simplifying it because as a therapist, this is hard work, but that's
right. Oh, no, right. Absolutely. That's great. And because I don't think that you mentioned this, but I think it's important for people to hear it. How much now of what we do is unconscious, are we seeing?
Most, but I want to do a caveat. There's no such thing as a pure unconscious process, and there's no such thing as a pure conscious process. Everything is a mix. Now, the relative percentage, if you want to use that kind of terminology, is it relatively conscious? Is it relatively unconscious? Now that we can talk about realistically. But to say this is unconscious, this is conscious, is a false dichotomy. We started by me saying, I'm having a conversation. The false dichotomy thing, I did not have a little man in my head telling me what to say. I just said it, but it's mostly conscious. So there's nothing that's purely unconscious or conscious. But if you want to ask, most of our behavior is unconscious because we burn out. You can't spend the whole day focused and thinking about stuff and doing things and saying, what are the you just have to behave automatically. You have to just go about your day. So most of what you do is unconscious. I don't know if I want to put a percentage on it, but if you ask me, I would say the vast majority of what we do is unconscious.
And so before we open it up for questions, if there was one takeaway that you wanted non-clinicians, just non-experts, just lay people, just regular people that are not in psychology, were never in therapy, what would you want them to know, take away from this?
Well, two things, and they're related. One is that you can't separate the two and say, I'm going to make the unconscious conscious, and then all of my behavior will be conscious. That's never going to happen. It's always going to be a mix. And the second thing is people seem to categorize the unconscious either as all bad, I need to overcome it, I need to defeat it, I need to make it go away, I need to make it conscious. That comes from the psychopathology part of it. That's just not true. Most of what the unconscious does is helpful to us. And the other side, that the unconscious is the seat of eternal wisdom, and I only have to trust my gut and go inside myself, and I will be a better human being, is also not totally true. It is what it is. Most of the time it works for you. It evolved like everything else, like your thumb, to help you adapt in the world. And like everything else, it has a cost. You know, we have feet to help us walk, which means now we don't climb trees as well. You know, the cheetah is built for speed, so it doesn't have a lot of stamina and strength. So the consciousness and unconsciousness have their benefits and they have their liabilities, and it's up to us to leverage the strengths and minimize the liabilities, as opposed to it's all good or it's all bad. And that's what I would hope to get to people.
Great. The words that I use instead of conscious or unconscious, because some people are too uncomfortable, is I use awareness versus unawareness.
Yes, I agree. And the reason I agree is our brains are organized associatively. Your associations to conscious and unconscious take you to a place that's not helpful, and your associations to aware and unaware take you to a place that's helpful, then that's where you should go. You know, the word doesn't mean anything. It's come to mean, you know, Freud or I'm asleep or something like that. If that's where you're going with it, being that I'm technically involved, I want the technical definition. It's not conscious, it's unconscious, but aware and unaware is perfectly fine.
Okay, this has been great, Joel. We're going to keep you on to take people's questions.
I wanted to hear about the magic trick about the subconscious. I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued because one of the things I feel like there's things going on with me sometimes, and I'm like, all right, unconscious, like what the heck? Like what do you want? Like, I feel like I don't know what that piece of me really wants, and that maybe I'm sometimes acting counter to my deepest desire, or there's something that if I knew it, I could then act more effectively in my life.
So you want a magic trick?
Yes, I'd love one.
Let's hope that it works.
Okay.
I have in my hand a jar, and it has 100 personality descriptions. Can you see that?
Yes.
There's no jar. I don't know what you're looking at. Anyway, let's pretend I have a jar with 100 personality descriptions. 90 of them are engineers, right? 90 of the slips of paper, and 10 of them are artists. 90 engineers, 10 artists. So I'm going to pull one out now, and I'm going to read it to you. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Emotionally sensitive and creative. Is that an artist? Is that an engineer?
Artist.
Artist. What are the numbers I just gave you?
90-10.
Which way?
90 engineer, 10
And
artist.
then you picked artist.
Right.
So do you actually believe that an engineer cannot possibly be creative or emotionally sensitive?
No, I don't.
Then why
Believe
the hell did you go against 90% odds? You should have said engineer, unless I pulled out a slip of paper that said, I am an artist and not an engineer, nor will I ever be an engineer. You should not care what I read. But you did something even more, since you wanted to know about the deepest stuff. It's harmless. You have a stereotype of an artist. That's what just happened.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And who cares? So you have a stereotype of an artist. You have a stereotype of an engineer. An engineer is a nerdy person who's kind of cold and intellectual. And an artist is a person who's very affectively driven and creative. That's your stereotype. Okay, who cares? Now let's move to the stereotype of women. Let's move to the stereotype of African Americans. You have the same stereotypes then. If this can work, when I gave you 90-10, imagine in the world when things are ambiguous. There's my magic trick.
I think Heidi wants to know what she can do about it, though, right?
That's a separate question, but you wanted a magic trick. Now, what can you do about it? Now that you know this, Heidi, are you going to be more aware next time you judge people? That's the idea. If you could do this and in such a clear way, when I went 90%, 10%, and so on, imagine what you do in ambiguous situations. So you need to know this about yourself, that you carry around stereotypes. You're a nice person, I'm sure. I like to think I'm a nice person, but we're all biased. We're all prejudiced, and we need to know that. So now your behavior has to be more based on that knowledge next time you interact with a person who's identified as some group or some sort.
Well,
the other thing, obviously, you can do is to go into therapy and learn about yourself. You can keep a diary, but be aware. So I would ask you, if you don't mind, I'll put you on the spot. Why in the world, when I emphasize 90-10, and I said it more than once, did you end up saying artist? In your mind, not now I've explained it, but in your mind.
I realized it was a generalization, but I went along with the stereotype. I went on the surface. I didn't probe and ask you more questions.
There you go. So what you need to do if you want to overcome these negatives is apply that brain that you have, the cortex that you have to the question, instead of just jumping into it. Kahneman and Tversky call this heuristics, cognitive heuristics. They're shortcuts that work most of the time, so we don't have to think about everything because thinking is effortful. But they don't work some of the time. And they were designed to work, you know, in a hunting-gathering society back in the Pleistocene era. I'm getting into weeds here, so I'm sorry. But they're not designed to work here. You know, you like, I don't know if you do, but most of us like sweets. Okay, that was good because fruits are sweet and nutritious food. Now we're eating sweets on steroids and we're getting diabetes. It was adaptive, now it's not. So you need to be aware that these generalizations are part of you. And there are other tricks I could use to tell you, but I just wanted to illustrate it.
I would just say that probably linked to that would be careful about stereotyping yourself.
That's true too. That's true too. Because here's another study. They did a study with African Americans and whites at Stanford. These are students at Stanford. So they're probably really bright people. And they told them in one condition, this is an IQ test. And in another condition, they told them, we'd like you to try this. When they told them it was an IQ test, the African Americans did worse than the white students. When they told them, here's a test that I'd like you to try out, I'm piloting a test, they did the same. So the African Americans had internalized the stereotype that they're not as smart. And it wasn't true. Right. So, you know, as a woman, you may have internalized, I should be passive, I should please other people. And you need to be aware that that's inside your head.
Great. Heidi, did your original question get answered?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Anyone else? And if you don't want to be in the hot seat, you can ask the question and I'll stop Joel from putting you in the hot seat. If that's going to intimidate you from, oh, good, good, good. Okay. Belinda, you can unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi, Belinda.
Thank you. This has been great. I wanted to know, I've been doing a lot of things about values, and so I wrote down my values as I was aware in my conscious, and then I went into my heart, closed my eyes, really focused on it. So is that my subconscious values? And if not, how can I find out what they are?
You can find out what they are by seeing how you behave. And I don't know you, but by coincidence, you seem to have some family rules behind you that I would guess have what your values are. Be generous with hugs, be yourself, be grateful. These are all, say I love you. These are all great things to now. Are they really you? I'm going to assume they are, but I don't know.
Yes.
So the way I would know and the way you should know is, okay, I'm glad these rules are there. I really believe in them at a conscious level. Do I instantiate them? In fact, is this how I behave? If this is how you behave, then those are genuine. And they're not ungenuine when you believe them and don't behave that way. They're just at a different level. We've studied what are called implicit motives, which you get by having people tell stories. And the way I would tell it to you as a person who's not going to give someone a storytelling task, people tell you stories all the time. What happened to them today, what they're in. There's always a theme in the story that's below the surface of the content. You know, people need to take care of me. I won. I did better. People like me. There's always some theme. And you can get what people's motives are by listening to the theme of the story as opposed to the content. And I think therapists have to do that or we'd be bored out of our minds, because I really don't care how come you were late on the subway. That's really not of interest to me. What's of interest to me is how you tell me the story. And then I try and pick that stuff up. And I think you're clearly someone who cares about these things, or you wouldn't put them on the wall. I don't have family rules on the wall. So that tells me something about you. So my guess is that you're sincere about them.
You know, also, Joel, I don't know what you think about this, but if you want to know what somebody truly values, look at where we spend our money. And so we may say that, or our energy and your time. So consciously you may say, like, I think you alluded to this earlier, you know, I really want to give a lot to other people. Okay, so how much of your income do you give to other people? Or how much time do you spend volunteering? And you're like, oh, so the behavior is sometimes inconsistent with what you think your value is. And that can just help you. And it doesn't mean it's not your value. It just means like you want to realign your life with your value. You go, okay, so maybe I need to stop putting so much energy in cleaning my house, which is not my issue, but in cleaning my house and then and then put more energy into volunteering, you know, but because it helps to just take stock so that you can figure out, oh, okay, so like I did that recently. I'm working a lot on the computer, you know, being home, and my number one value is my daughter. And then recently she said to me, you know, we don't really spend a lot of time together. And I went, oh my goodness, she is my number one priority, and yet I'm not prioritizing her in terms of time. So it helped me to change that, and now I made sure that every day when we go over, so it wasn't on purpose, but I was being unconscious in doing that.
Yeah, you were being driven by the moment.
And my coping mechanisms too, when I'm stressed, I work. So, but that was getting in the way of dealing with one of my most important value is my daughter. So it's interesting. You know?
I ask people sometimes, if your house was on fire, what's the first thing you'd grab? And you find out a lot by finding out what's the first thing they would grab. Is that kind of tells you your value. What are you unwilling to lose? I see people nodding and smiling because...
That actually was a clue in a Sherlock Holmes story. They deliberately set a fire to see the first thing that the person would do. What would they grab?
I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan. I wonder if that was in my mind without my realizing.
Maybe. Unconscious, yes.
Unconscious, that's right.
Any other questions? Keep it coming. Don't be afraid.
Hello.
Hi, Earl.
I'm just fully intrigued, enthralled, and enjoying this conversation because Raheem and I are always talking about the conscious and unconscious, and he actually just showed me something about heuristic, the definition. So we tend to dine on the conscious and unconscious. Even as a teenager, I tried to train myself to behave a certain way, like to do certain things so that it would become part of my nature, like be efficient about how I go about doing things, but just kind of train myself, even from young, to try to be a certain way with certain things.
Sure.
And it helps. It helps because then, it just becomes second nature, which is the point. If you want to train good behaviors and things that are effective, once you do that and you start early, it can become a part of how you do stuff. And I mean, it could be good. I mean, bad things, of course, you try to steer away from, but
So Earl, you're talking about what I call making the conscious unconscious. So you were consciously aware of how you wanted to behave. And you said, in order to behave that way, it has to become part of me. In order for it to become part of me, I have to practice it. And I'm guessing it worked.
Yeah, and definitely in some regard. Like, there's certain things that I'll do now that if somebody, like, let's say an email came in as a project that I needed to do, and it was simple enough, I tend to jump right on it so that I can get it out of the way so that I don't have it pile up on me. So then let's say a few days later, somebody will say, yeah, there's a file I asked you about. And I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I sent it. And then I'll go, and 9 times out of 10, I did, because I trained myself to get on it right away if it's simple enough and just get it off on the table so I don't have it pile up with other things that are going to come down the road. So
you're going to have to teach me that, Earl. I'm not that good at that.
Can I just jump in and say, man, if I wish I had been like that when I was 17 or however.
Earl's going to be a role model to all of us.
Holy cow. I'm still working on that, Earl. Can I learn from you?
Yeah, well.
No, there's still a lot of things that I haven't done. So trust me, I'm way behind on certain things, but certain things I kind of got. So.
Wow, good for you.
But that's the principle. Joking aside, that's the principle. If you practice something long enough, it becomes automatic. That none of us think about how to drive a car, but if you remember when you first started, it's like hand here, right foot on the, and God forbid it was a stick shift, which I used to drive. Now I got a left foot, and then it became automatic to the point where I no longer had a stick shift. I was informed by my wife that this would no longer be the case, so I ended up without a stick shift. My left foot is still moving. It's moving to step on the clutch that isn't there anymore because it has become automatic.
And I know for many, many people in people that I deal with all the time in terms of both friends, family members, and my clients and people I work with, is that we, and myself, is try not to automatically react, as we were talking about earlier, and respond. And it's amazing that once you do the pause, once you stop and you do that enough, people come back and say, and I even find it in myself, it does work. You just keep doing it, you keep doing it, you keep doing it. And the key that I find is most important is for people to realize it, is to really realize it and acknowledge the fact that that is the good thing is happening. Like Earl, when you were saying that, so did you like over the years go, okay, yes, I'm doing this, and acknowledging the fact that it came and you're doing it? Because that's the piece, so that you make what you're doing conscious so that it then becomes unconscious.
Yeah, that's what I would say. Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hour rule. If you put 10,000 hours into anything, you suddenly become, not suddenly, 10,000 a long time, you become an expert at it. And,
10,000 hours, yeah, we weren't sure we were talking about this the other day. 10,000 hours.
10,000 hours. I don't know if Malcolm Gladwell is the first person to come up with that number or he got it out of research, but that's where I learned it. And, it's not really, it could be 9,000, could be 11,000. The point is that if you practice something often enough, it becomes part of who you are to the point that you're now an expert at it. So whatever that happens to be, if it's an athlete, if it's a musician, if it's psychotherapy, if it's, fixing roofs, it's all the same. Practice makes it work. Ooh, people raise their hands. I feel like I'm teaching a class. Okay.
Belinda.
I have another question. So I understand about the practice, and although I know there's other ways to achieve this, let's just say that your son can do certain things that would irritate you, and he's 11. And so I know that there's other tools to use, but is there a tool, a way to practice not getting irritated besides getting rid of whatever that anchor is or whatever it is? Can you actually practice not being irritated when they're not there, kind of like imagine the situation over and over and over? How do you practice that?
I'm laughing because I have 2 teenage sons. And I think it's hopeless. No, I think in order to do something like that, you have to try to see the world from their point of view, because they're doing it for a reason. It's having an effect on you. I had a patient many years ago who, so I think I can talk about it without revealing anything, who came in and she was grossly obese. And she said, I'm here, I want to lose weight. And I thought, okay, that's a goal, that's fine. And then she said, and I'm not exercising, and I'm not going on a diet. Don't even ask me to park a block away from where I'm going to go. And then she pulled a candy bar out of her purse and said, I'm not giving this up. And then she folded her arms. Now, my first reaction was, get the hell out of my office. Stop wasting my time. And then, and then the therapy became how I wasn't helping her. So it was 45 minutes of how useless I am. And then she would ask at the end, can she come in more often? And I thought, well, you didn't abuse me enough? 45 minutes wasn't enough? You need 90 minutes to abuse me? And what I was able to do, apropos of what you're saying, it's easier with someone you don't know than someone you do who knows your buttons, was imagine living a life like this. Everyone probably rejects her. I'm like the only person that hasn't rejected her, so she wants to come in more often. But her coping mechanism stinks. Belinda, I don't know how to tell you this, but when he becomes a teenager, it's going to be more. But
I know.
See the world. The only thing you could do, I think, is to try to see the world from their point of view. Not to agree with it, but where are they coming from? This doesn't work. It's never worked. It's not going to work in the future. It doesn't work now. Why are they behaving this way? And then say the same thing about yourself. So I get angry at my teenage boy, and what do they want? They want to fight anyway, because the hormones are raging and I'm giving them what they want. This is not going to work. Does it mean I'm always great? No. But that understanding helps me. And I don't know what your 11-year-old boy does, but whatever it does, he's doing for a reason, and he's not getting what he wants. Or he's getting it into, maybe he wants your attention, and negative is better than none. I don't know. I don't know if that was helpful or not, but
No, that was. Thank you.
Well, what if you're doing something for an unknown reason and you don't know why? What if it's yourself?
Yeah, that's how I earn a living, actually. But the way you could do it for yourself is, I'm not getting what I want. So what am I doing?
Why am I doing
that's not working here? You know, I want someone. What's the extreme example? You tell someone this relationship isn't working out. I don't think we can continue. And the other person starts screaming at you, as though now you're going to say, well, now that you're screaming at me, I realize we should be together. And yet it's a normal reaction on a lot of people. So you should think to yourself, okay, what I really want is X, and I'm not getting it. So what am I doing, and what can I do differently? And if you're in therapy, that's kind of like half the work.
I mean, you know, and just to add to that, yes, and it also could be, what am I getting from continuing to do? What's the gain? What am I getting from continuing to do it?
Good point.
But sometimes that's even bigger. Or what else will I lose if I make that change? And that is a therapy thing, because sometimes, you know, it's and this is unconscious. We may lose other things if we make that one change, and when we make that conscious, then we can deal with it. But you know, like you said, there's a lot to say about that.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of testing that goes on. I've done this, you still love me.
Right. Joel, this has been great, consciously, unconsciously, subconsciously, all the different levels. Yay. So really, and Joel has a book called, as I mentioned earlier, The Unconscious. If anybody, I have to read it. It's on my list of books to read, but you know, I've listened to his talks and it's great. And please, everybody, you can go out. It's on Amazon, right? I'm sure.
Yeah, on Amazon.
On Amazon,
And
yeah.
it took us months to come up with the brilliant title about, since it's about the unconscious, we'll just call it The Unconscious. A lot of thinking went into that. So.
A lot of conscious thinking.
Yes, that's right. Shall we call it like the book? No, I don't think that's going to work. So we ended up calling it The Unconscious. I actually wanted to call it something else, but my publisher said, no, this is the best title, and he convinced me.
And we also want to do a shout out to the Mentor Project for hosting these. This is really great. You can check out the Mentor Project on Facebook or mentorproject.org. And you can see great interviews with mentors. Joel also gives a full explanation about the unconscious, and there's more research that he presents in that talk. and there's lots of other great, great talks. And if you're interested, you can also be a mentor, or you can just contribute. And please come back. We are here every Wednesday at 6 o'clock. If you have any ideas for future topics that you want Dr. Susan to cover, I'd be happy to do that. And Joel, thank you again so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Susan. This was really fun. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Debbie. I hope that this series finds you healthy, well, and if you have any questions or comments or need any further information, please contact me. You can reach me at yourvoice@drsusan.nyc. yourvoice@drsusan.nyc or drsusan@drsusancares.com. drsusan@drsusancares.com. Please be safe. Please take care of you and your loved ones. And I look forward to seeing you at the next episode of Your Voice with Dr. Susan, the home edition. Thank you.
Some people commonly misperceive it that an introvert is just somebody who's solitary or who's reclusive, like Emily Dickinson, or that an extrovert has to be the uber extrovert, like Bill Clinton was an uber extrovert. Like, he not only loved the campaign trail, but reports are that when he was with people in a room, you couldn't get him out because he loved talking to everybody and he loved the energy of people. But it turns out that what we're looking for is the sweet spot of energy. And the thing is that extroverts need a lot of stimulation to feel energized. Introverts get stimulated pretty easily, and so they retreat to regenerate. And ambiverts kind of need both that external and a good deal of that internal to get their sweet spot. So again, I like to think of it also as we all need to find our sweet spot in terms of how we get energized and how we feel fulfilled. And of course, you know, introversion and extroversion are just one dimension of that, but they're pretty crucial. You know, one of the things with working with college students and also just working with people of this generation, it's wonderful that people are so idealistic and wanting to change things. But I think one of the problems of our political culture right now is that we don't know how to compromise, and we also don't know how to carry the messy mixture of what it is to be human. And I think sometimes I think I've mentioned this to the last time we talked about, is that I think it's a symptom of the perfectionism and narcissism of our culture.
So when we talk about work, or we talk about you just mentioned something really beautiful. You said that there's something that shames us, and then we don't try it again. We don't try to do something again because we say, oh my God, I did speaking, and then I went on a stage, and then there were 5,000 people, and I just made a complete fool of myself. The embodied work that I do around shame brings with it a lot of experiential work in the body. And the grounding for what it is that I'm talking about, and you have to imagine you have a vessel, you have a vase. Your body is the vase. And the emotions that we have about shame is tons of water coming into this vase, okay? But if the vase is only able to hold a gallon, and we are pouring 15 gallons into this vase, the vase is either going to break, it can't handle it, the emotions go overboard. So our bodies are the same. The distinction here is that our body is not a glass vessel. Our body is a moving, living, breathing masterpiece that can emotionally get bigger. It can go bigger and it can contract. The reason why we feel shame is because we're contracted, because we contracted as children. Yet as adults, we have the capacity to stand and breathe and meditate and have our consciousness say, okay, this is just someone yelling at me. This is just a group of people making fun of me. It doesn't matter what they're saying, but that's hard. To get there is hard. To become a stronger consciousness vessel and be forthright with what I feel and my vulnerability without collapsing, without becoming reactive, then I can trust myself to go into a situation and be exactly who I am, no more or no less, and accept people for being exactly who they are, which is the foundation of a safe space.
You have to look at, what type of information is being provided. So it's one thing to criticize or blame something or say, okay, this person's wrong, but are you providing solutions? And are you providing evidence behind your proposed solutions? So some of these things are fairly straightforward. Like, for instance, it's a virus, and the virus spreads from person to person. And so if someone's saying, don't use separation in terms of physical distancing, social distancing, and when we say social distancing, we don't mean, cut off communication with people. We mean try to keep distance. And if someone's saying, oh, no, we don't do that, well, it's still a virus, and it still will spread if there's physical contact. So unless you can provide an alternative to that, you have to go with that intervention. So really checking to see if people are walking you through the explanation.
In most cases, kids are pretty self-optimizing. They don't need us to tinker with every little thing about them. They typically are pretty good at pursuing what they need for development. And what is that? They need to mess around with stuff and figure it out. They need social interaction and friends, which obviously is a little challenge right now during social distancing. And they need parents that show them support and love. And when you have those basic things, kids tend to do really very well.